The United States of America emerged not merely from revolutionary fervor and Enlightenment ideals, but from a complex web of financial necessity, economic ambition, and fiscal crisis. To understand the true birth of this nation, one must follow the money, trace the debts, the taxes, the currencies, and the economic pressures that transformed 13 disparate colonies into a unified republic. This is the story of how America's financial origins shaped its destiny and created the economic framework that would support the world's most powerful democracy. Long before the shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, the American colonies existed within Britain's mercantilist system, a carefully constructed economic arrangement designed to enrich the mother country. Under mercantilism, colonies existed for one purpose: to provide raw materials to Britain and serve as captive markets for British manufactured goods. The colonies shipped tobacco, rice, indigo, timber, and furs across the Atlantic, while British factories turned these raw materials into finished products that were then sold back to the colonists at significant markup. This system, enforced through a series of navigation acts beginning in 1651, required that most colonial trade be conducted on British ships and pass through British ports, where it could be properly taxed and controlled. For decades, this arrangement proved tolerable, even beneficial, to many colonists. British credit financed colonial expansion, British military power protected colonial frontiers, and British markets provided reliable demand for colonial products. The colonies grew prosperous, developing their own merchant class, establishing banks and credit networks, and creating a sophisticated commercial culture that rivaled anything in Europe. Colonial merchants in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston became wealthy men, building grand houses and accumulating capital that would later fuel revolutionary activity. However, the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, fundamentally altered this relationship. Lasting from 1754 to 1763, this global conflict pitted Britain against France for dominance in North America and around the world. Britain emerged victorious, driving France from North America and securing vast new territories for the crown. But victory came at an enormous price. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled during the war, rising from approximately £75 million to over £130 million, a staggering sum that consumed more than half of the government's annual revenue just to service the interest payments. Parliament looked to the American colonies, which had benefited immensely from British military protection, to help shoulder this financial burden. The logic seemed impeccable from London's perspective. British taxpayers paid an average of 26 shillings per person in taxes, while colonists paid only about 1 shilling. The colonies were wealthy, they had been defended at great expense, and surely they could contribute more to the empire's finances. What Parliament failed to appreciate was how fundamentally this new approach would challenge colonial conceptions of their rights as Englishmen and their economic autonomy. The Sugar Act of 1764 marked the beginning of this new imperial policy. Unlike previous trade regulations designed primarily to control commerce, the Sugar Act explicitly aimed to raise revenue. It reduced the tax on molasses imported from non-British colonies, but promised strict enforcement, eliminating the widespread smuggling that had made the previous tax largely meaningless. More significantly, the act restructured the Colonial Customs Service, creating vice admiralty courts without juries to try smuggling cases, and requiring that accused smugglers prove their innocence rather than placing the burden of proof on the prosecution. Colonial merchants, accustomed to friendly local juries and lax enforcement, suddenly faced a system designed to extract money rather than regulate trade. The following year brought the Stamp Act, a measure that would ignite the first empire-wide crisis. This legislation required that printed materials in the colonies, newspapers, legal documents, licenses, playing cards, even dice, carry an embossed revenue stamp purchased from British authorities. The tax was modest, ranging from a halfpenny to several pounds depending on the document, and it was already common in Britain itself. But in America, it produced a firestorm of opposition that surprised British officials. The Stamp Act touched virtually every colonist, affecting lawyers, merchants, printers, tavern keepers, and ordinary citizens conducting daily business. More fundamentally, it represented direct taxation by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation. The colonial response combined principled constitutional objections with effective economic resistance. Intellectuals and pamphleteers articulated the doctrine that taxation without representation violated the fundamental rights of Englishmen. The Virginia House of Burgesses, led by Patrick Henry, passed resolutions declaring that only the colonial assembly could tax Virginians. In Massachusetts, James Otis helped organize the Stamp Act Congress, which brought together delegates from 9 colonies to coordinate opposition. Meanwhile, merchants organized non-importation agreements, refusing to buy British goods until the act was repealed. Groups calling themselves Sons of Liberty intimidated stamp distributors into resigning, making the law unenforceable. This combination of constitutional argument and economic pressure proved effective. British merchants, facing devastating losses from the American boycott, pressured Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. Colonial celebrations were premature, however, as Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The constitutional question remained unresolved, a ticking time bomb in the heart of the empire. Parliament's next attempt at raising colonial revenue came through the Townshend Acts of 1767, named for Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend. These acts imposed duties on imported glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea, items the colonies could not produce themselves and therefore had to import. The revenue would pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, making these officials independent of colonial legislatures that had previously controlled their compensation. Once again, colonists organized boycotts, and once again, British merchants suffered. By 1770, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, keeping only the tax on tea as a symbolic assertion of its taxing authority. The tea tax might have remained a minor irritant had the East India Company not faced financial collapse. This massive corporation, which effectively governed British India, teetered on bankruptcy in 1773, threatening to take down British banks and aristocratic fortunes with it. Parliament's solution, the Tea Act, allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies without paying certain duties, making their tea cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea even with the Townshend tax included. This should have pleased colonists, who could now buy tea at lower prices. Instead, it unified colonial opposition like nothing before. The Tea Act threatened colonial merchants who profited from the tea trade, but more importantly, it represented a cunning attempt to trick colonists into accepting parliamentary taxation by making it financially advantageous. In ports throughout the colonies, citizens prevented tea ships from unloading their cargo. In Boston, the situation escalated when Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to let the tea ships return to Britain without unloading and paying the tax. On the night of December 16, 1773, dozens of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships and dumped 45 tons of tea worth nearly 10,000 pounds into Boston Harbor, an act of destruction equivalent to roughly $1 million today. Parliament's response, the Coercive Acts of 1774, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston's port until the city paid for the destroyed tea, restructured Massachusetts' government to increase royal control, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than colonial courts. These punitive measures, intended to isolate and punish Massachusetts, instead prompted sympathy and support from other colonies. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, bringing together delegates from 12 colonies to coordinate resistance. They organized a comprehensive boycott of British goods and began preparing for possible military conflict. When fighting erupted at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the colonies faced an immediate financial crisis. War required money, enormous amounts of it, to pay soldiers, purchase weapons and supplies, and sustain armies in the field. The colonies had no central treasury, no power to levy taxes, and no established credit with foreign powers. The Second Continental Congress, which assumed responsibility for coordinating the war effort, resorted to printing paper money called continental currency. Without gold or silver backing, and with no taxing authority to guarantee redemption, these bills initially circulated based solely on faith in the revolutionary cause. The Continental Congress issued increasingly large quantities of this currency to pay for the war. In 1775, it authorized $6 million in continental currency. By 1779, the total had reached over $240 million. Predictably, massive inflation resulted. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered American vocabulary as the currency depreciated to a tiny fraction of its face value. By 1781, It took 100 continental dollars to purchase what $1 had bought in 1775. This hyperinflation devastated creditors, pensioners, and anyone on fixed incomes, while benefiting debtors who could repay loans in worthless paper. The financial chaos created profound hardship and nearly destroyed the revolutionary cause. Individual states also issued their own paper currencies, adding to the confusion. Each state's money had different values and acceptance, complicating interstate commerce and creating opportunities for speculation and fraud. Soldiers suffered especially, receiving pay in depreciated currency that could barely buy necessities. The Continental Army faced constant supply shortages, inadequate clothing, and insufficient food, not because these items didn't exist, but because the money to purchase them had become nearly worthless. Foreign loans provided crucial support. France, eager to weaken Britain, secretly supplied funds and military supplies even before formally entering the war in 1778. French financial support totaled approximately 6 million livres by 1776, delivered through a fictitious company to maintain deniability. After openly allying with America, France provided additional loans and subsidies totaling over 25 million livres. Spain and the Netherlands also extended credit, though on more limited scales. Without these foreign loans, the revolution likely would have collapsed under its own financial weight. Robert Morris, appointed superintendent of finance in 1781, brought desperately needed financial management to the struggling government. A wealthy Philadelphia merchant, Morris used his personal credit to support the war effort, sometimes paying army expenses from his own funds. He established the Bank of North America, the nation's first central bank, which provided short-term loans and helped stabilize the currency. Morris's financial acumen kept the army supplied during the crucial final campaigns of the war, but even his considerable talents could not solve the fundamental problem. The Continental Congress lacked the power to tax, and therefore had no reliable source of revenue. When the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war in 1783, the United States had accumulated debts totaling approximately $79 million, $42 million owed domestically and $37 million owed to foreign governments, primarily France. The states owed additional millions in their own war debts. With no federal taxing power, no functioning currency, and a barely operational government under the Articles of Confederation, the new nation faced potential financial collapse and dismemberment. This crisis gave birth to the Constitution and the federal financial system that would secure America's future. Alexander Hamilton, appointed Treasury Secretary by President George Washington in 1789, presented a comprehensive financial plan that would transform the United States from a bankrupt debtor into a credit-worthy nation. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume all state war debts, funding them along with federal debts through new bond issues backed by reliable federal revenues from tariffs and excise taxes. This controversial plan sparked fierce debate, with opponents arguing it unfairly benefited northern states and speculators who had bought up depreciated securities. Hamilton prevailed through political compromise, agreeing to support placing the nation's capital on the Potomac River in exchange for Southern votes for his financial plan. The Funding Act of 1790 and the assumption of state debts created a unified national debt of approximately $75 million, now backed by federal taxing power. Hamilton's system worked brilliantly. By demonstrating that the United States would honor its obligations, he established the nation's credit both domestically and internationally. Interest rates on government bonds fell as investors gained confidence. The federal government could now borrow money at reasonable rates to finance internal improvements and national defense. Hamilton's creation of the first Bank of the United States in 1791 provided additional financial stability. This institution, chartered for 20 years with the federal government owning 20% and private investors owning 80%, served as the government's fiscal agent, holding deposits, transferring funds, and helping collect taxes. It also issued currency backed by specie, providing a stable medium of exchange that helped commerce flourish. The bank's branches throughout the country created America's first truly national financial institution. The financial system Hamilton created reflected his vision of America's economic future. He believed the nation should encourage manufacturing, develop infrastructure, foster commerce, and maintain strong ties between government and the business community. His reports on public credit, banking, and manufactures laid out a comprehensive program for economic development that anticipated many features of modern capitalism. Critics, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, feared Hamilton's system concentrated too much power in the federal government and favored commercial interests over agricultural ones. This debate would shape American politics for generations. The United States had been born from financial crisis and forged in the crucible of economic necessity. The inability to tax had made the revolution nearly impossible to win. The lack of sound currency had created chaos and hardship. The burden of debt had threatened the nation's survival. From these harsh lessons came a constitution that granted the federal government clear taxing and borrowing powers, and a financial system that turned debt from a weakness into a strength by demonstrating creditworthiness and creating instruments that facilitated capital formation and economic growth. The financial origins of the United States were not merely a prelude to the nation's political founding, but were inextricably woven into its very fabric, shaping its institutions, its economy, and its future as a great power.